Two priests on the patio, pull up a chair and watch the show. If there's anything you want to know, just ask. Two priests on the patio, yeah.
Hello, welcome to our next installment of Two Priests on the Patio. My name is Jeff Ward. I am the priest at St. Cuthbert's Anglican Church in Southeast Oakville.
I'm Sue Ann Ward. I'm the priest at Grace Anglican Church in Waterdown.
And with us today is Lucy, our wonder dog. She's just not in the shot right now, but she's here. So we're going to continue our series on the top 10 reasons why some people are allergic to church. And today what we want to focus on is the apparent, and I'm going to argue, created conflict between science and the Bible, or science and religion. And in particular, how it relates to the creation of all things. So this is actually going to end up being a two-part series because there's a lot of complexities for us to talk about. But as usual, I want to start by reading scripture for you. And so I'm going to be reading from John's Gospel, and this is from chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. This is the gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. So we have a challenging topic today. And we're going to have to unfold a little bit of science as we go along.
Just remember, I'm the physicist, she's the biologist, so I'll be nodding a lot and she's going to be explaining a lot. So,
well, we're just going to have a conversation about this and see where it takes us. But we know many people in our world that are strongly opposed to religion. And for many of those people, the biggest challenge to religion, in their minds anyway, is science. And part of that has to do with our scriptures and how our scriptures have been used by people in ways that really, I guess, haven't been helpful, right?
Well, they fly in the face of obvious science, and therefore we immediately lose credibility when we're using them and talking about them.
Mm-hmm. Things like our creation stories.
Our creation stories, and how long have people been on Earth, or how long has the universe existed, and so on. It doesn't line up. So.
Right. So we have at least two creation stories in our scriptures, one in Genesis chapter 1 and one in Genesis chapter 2. And many people will point to those stories and say, this is proof that a God did not create the world, or at least not in this way. They'll point to things like the fact that one of the stories has a talking snake in it.
Yes.
And insist that God kicked people out of a garden because they ate from a certain tree. There's other things. There's the length of time. Some Christians say that the world has existed. Some have done some math using passages of scriptures and said, the world's only a few thousand years old. When I think most of us can agree that there's evidence that our planet is much, much older than that. So I think as people of faith, we have done a disservice to ourselves in many respects.
And as people of science, which we are, we're also aware that scientists have created a false dichotomy often, and for whatever reason have decided, and possibly it started with the church killing scientists, but scientists have divorced themselves from the idea that God or a creator could coexist with the science that we have observed and that we've studied. And so we've sort of created this wall between us that says that both can't exist, that elements of science can't exist if a God exists. And so as a scientist, you would say, well, therefore God can't exist. And even Darwin's theory hasn't always been portrayed, even as Darwin wrote it, much less used in a way that would be consistent.
Right. So when I was in high school, I can remember being taught in biology class that evolution was fact, and that because there was evolution, there was no need for a God, and because there's so much silliness in the Bible, there can't be a God, right? It's just all made up to make people feel better. And we learned about what we were told was Darwin's theory of evolution, and that's how everything came about. So Darwin, back in the 1860s, published his On the Origin of Species, and he put forward a theory of natural selection. So we're going to talk about that a little bit because it's really at the heart of our discussion and of this dichotomy between science and religion.
If I might just say at this point, what I learned in physics in high school was the Big Bang Theory. And thank goodness a wonderful comedy was created out of that, because we're not going to say any more about the Big Bang Theory throughout these two segments. So we're going to just stick to the biology.
Having said that, the Big Bang Theory TV show put forth a lot of very bad science, but that's a whole different topic. All right, so natural selection. So we have a very intelligent scientist named Darwin, who I have a great deal of respect for. What Darwin observed is that within any species, within any population of species, there's variations. He liked to talk about finches. That was one of his main examples, and about the difference in their beak size. And just like Jeff has a small nose and I have a big nose, finches have different sizes and shapes of noses. And what he observed was that in an instance where there was some pressure put on the population because of a drought, more of the finches with long beaks survived than finches with short beaks, because the long-beaked finches were able to get at some food that was deep down in the ground. And they were able to eat, they were able to stay healthy, they were able to survive and reproduce. And they reproduced finches that looked a lot like themselves, finches with long beaks. Sadly, many of the finches with short beaks didn't survive because they had a harder time getting to their food source. And so short-beaked finches died off, long-beaked finches survived, and what you ended up with was a population of finches with longer beaks. We see this kind of microevolution around us all the time. Jeff talked about our dog Lucy earlier, and if we look at dogs, what we see is a lot of microevolution in all of the breeding that goes on with dogs. That's why we have everything from, tiny little teacup chihuahuas to great, big, huge, sturdy Newfoundlanders, right? Examples of microevolution.
What's astonishing, though, is how much of their DNA is identical.
Yes, despite how different they can look. All right, so we have this theory of natural selection that says that gradually over time, small changes occur that can cause changes in a whole population. And that's a brilliant observation that Darwin made. Then Darwin expanded upon that a little bit. And he said, what if the whole reason we have this great diversity of life on our planet is because from some common ancestor that changed a little over time, we ended up with changes and changes and changes and changes that resulted in many different species. And Darwin created this diagram of this tree, right, where you have all different species originating at different times, and that's how we apparently originated from apes, according to this theory. And again, today we're not going to talk about whether we actually originated from apes or not, but we just want to put forward Darwin's theory. Now, Darwin actually said, and I'd like to quote him, he said, If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. I think his theory, that big theory of macroevolution, of the development of all those different species, might break down. But let's look at something a little bit different with regard to Darwin's theory. What Darwin's theory never did explain was the actual origin of life. Once you have life, you can have animals with different sized beaks, and you can have change within a population. But you have to have the life in the first place, right? Natural selection doesn't work unless there's something to select. But Darwin never actually talks about that origin of life.
Unfortunately, you might not know that if you took biology in high school or even in university, because you might have been told that his theory actually did try to explain that and did do so successfully, and yet it never did.
It did not. So other people put forward ideas, right? There was this whole idea that there was some kind of primordial soup on our planet that had perhaps all of the chemical building blocks for life, that maybe just kind of randomly came together with, I don't know, heat and lightning and whatnot to create amino acids, because you need amino acids to create proteins, and you need proteins to create cells, and cells are the most basic form of life.
And you need them to create all life.
Exactly.
All organisms need cells. That means you can go all the way backwards to the fact that they all need those amino acids. And somehow they have to come together in the right order, in the right shape.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that the most basic protein needs 100 amino acids. So you needed this random thing to happen at least 100 times, and for all of them to come together in just the right way.
To make one protein in one cell.
Well, actually, you need 600 proteins to make a cell.
Fair enough.
So 100 amino acids to make a protein, 600 proteins minimum to make a cell. Most cells have thousands of protein molecules in them. So this whole idea of this primordial soup and chance just happening really isn't very likely. It's not likely at all. In fact, mathematically, when you run the numbers, which many people have, it just didn't happen by chance.
I've never seen so many zeros, even in my life in finance. It just goes on and on forever.
Now you have another challenge, because let's say you've got a whole bunch of proteins that did somehow miraculously develop, and they globbed together to make a cell. Well, a cell isn't just a little blob of something. It is the most complex thing imaginable. It has all of these little organelles and little machines that do different functions so that the cell can live and survive. Because cells have to be able to take in food, they have to be able to metabolize it, they have to be able to transport things around in the cell, they have to be able to eliminate waste, they've got to be able to grow, they've got to be able to reproduce and make new cells, especially if you want natural selection to happen, right? No natural selection without reproduction and the passing on of traits. So how does all that happen? Where do those little machines come from? How were the machines created? Those little molecular machines. How do they know what to do? How do they know when to do it? Well, when I look around the world and I see a machine, even a very simple machine, a machine like the video camera that's recording us, some intelligent being created that machine. to do a certain task. And so I would infer that in order for those machines to exist in ourselves, some intelligent being designed them.
And not only design, as Sue Ann said, in that one device are thousands of different components, and every one of them had to be designed for a particular purpose, and then had to be assembled just the right way, or else it wouldn't work at all. Now, even in 2 sessions, we're only going to be able to just sort of scratch the surface about this. But that's all we have time for today. But what we were just talking about sets us up perfectly for our next conversation next week about how we get from this idea of Darwinism to the idea of intelligent design. But for now, please stay safe, please be healthy, please take care of each other.
And lots of love from us to you, and love from Lucy too. May God bless you.
God bless you.